Welcome back after a few week delay to our study on biblical interpretation, Christ and biblical interpretation. My goal in these lessons is to discuss um, how to interpret the Bible, trying to help those of you who grew up in what is commonly referred to as dispensationalism and to try to provide you an alternative or what I would, without sounding completely arrogant, a more faithful way to interpret the Bible. Um, so, what I have done so far is just set the stage on this. I have talked in the first session just about interpreting the Bible by the Bible itself. Last time I talked about the defining features of the system of dispensationalism, and today I want to. This will probably take two or three uh, sessions on the history of where this came from. I wanted to do this because if you grew up in a church or within dispensational circles, even if you didn't know that name, it doesn't matter. You may not know the history. You may just assume that this is what Christians from all time have always believed. And that just isn't so. And I think the historical question on this issue is particularly important. Now, the history of doctrine or the history of biblical interpretation isn't the ultimate test. That's why I began session one with we need to interpret the Bible by the Bible. Uh, and yet, the formation of doctrine in the history of the church is an important question, and one that, unfortunately, those within more dispensational circles typically ignore almost completely church history. In fact, it's one of the virtues is just reading the Bible itself and not turning to any other sources or historical developments or anything. And that might sound virtuous, but it is, I think, ultimately unhelpful. Anyways, again, I want to be careful here. I am I'm trying to do this gently in a spirit of care. I don't at all have any antagonism. I, I'm just simply trying to present you here in these sessions the historical facts. I'm getting some of this from dispensational histories itself, from historians writing on these things who don't have a dog in the fight, and then from others who would be in agreement with me commenting on that. It's taken me some time to put this together. It's been 3 weeks or so since the last of these videos, and part of that has been I've done a lot of studying, and then we had Thanksgiving and deer hunting and all of that in there. So let me begin with, just briefly before 1800, let's say, the doctrines that I discussed last time, particularly the separation between Israel and the church, a very literal, just a woodenly literal interpretation of the Bible, a pre-millennial uh, return of Christ that is pre-tribulational, and this idea of the pre-trib rapture, along with some other doctrines that are hallmarks of dispensation, was really unheard of before this time and really didn't develop until the middle of the 1800s. It didn't come over here to the US until the later 1800s. So the wider background of this, uh, you know, I have to use some terms that are maybe more technical. I'll try to just, define them. But, it's just like if you were in some trade, an electrician or whatever, you have lingo that you use among electricians that seem foreign and maybe intimidating when you're not around electricians or you're not an electrician or maybe an engineer or a doctor or a nurse or and any vocation has their lingo. And so I have to use some of that lingo in this area. And one of those is millenarianism. So you hear the word millennium in there, millenarian. Uh, this is a view of the church, or a view of scripture, I should say, view of the world, really, that is apocalyptic. It usually rises up when there are seasons in the world that are particularly chaotic, disturbing, deeply concerning, very pessimistic. And so this doctrinal understanding began during the French Revolution in the 1790s. It was an awful decade um, of apocalyptic like horror in Europe. And so we're in Europe right now. All of this history, this early history for the first 50, 75 years is taking place in Europe and mainly just in England and Scotland. It really never takes root in the continent of Europe. A little bit when one of the founding fathers went over to Switzerland and maybe some other places. And it really didn't even last that long in England and Scotland, but it really took root in America starting in the later 1800s and early to mid 1900s. But anyways, where we are now is in Europe, French Revolution, and this kind of apocalyptic view of the world began to focus some Christians, particularly in England and Scotland, on interpreting those apocalyptic prophetic books of the Bible. So you're thinking Daniel and Revelation, particularly. So there became just this focus on those parts of scripture that seemed to jive with the world at that time. And so they began to be convinced that the events happening during the French Revolution were fulfilling the those prophetic apocalyptic scriptures, particularly Daniel 7 and Revelation 13. So, for instance, in 1798, French troops under Napoleon um, sent the Pope into exile. And in Revelation 13, there is this beast, um, this awful, horrible, satanic monster who has heads, and one of his heads is mortally wounded. Well, they interpreted what happened in 1978 when the French troops sent the Pope into exile as fulfilling that. Um, and so that became the rage. How do we interpret current world events and in the books of Daniel and Revelation and other prophetic apocalyptic literature as fulfilling those events right then and there? And then how can we kind of set the prophetic clock and time out when these other events are going to happen? And so this may sound familiar to you. This is kind of the rage in some circles here today. And I think it's helpful for you to understand that this is somewhat new. It's just been happening in the last 220 some years or so. And some of the very texts that prophecy today people point to as fulfilling modern events have been in those last 200 years used several times over to date other events. And that becomes a hallmark of this entire movement. Dating events from passages of scripture. And so there just became a consuming focus on interpreting prophetic scriptures very, very literally. And so another example from this time is there was a battle. I don't even know how to say the word. Aboukir Bay, Aboukir Bay, Napoleon, and that fulfills Daniel 11, verse 30. And so it's kind of just seeing prophecy or prophets like Daniel as just soothsayers. They say these verses, these prophets have these statements, and all of these statements is just bare future predictions. That's all they are. And it's the job of Christians to match those bare future predictions with current and then futuristic events to their time. So again, this is one of the reasons I just can't sign on to this, because there's been a 200 plus year history of taking these Daniel chapter 11, verse 30 verses, and tying them to events that one said fulfilled in 1790 something under Napoleon. And then 20 years later, that same verse is applied to something there, and then there, and then there. And it's like, okay, one of the funniest ones is as these meetings of these people doing this began, one of them found a passage, a verse in Daniel that seemed to prophesy that very meeting. Um, so, anyways, along with this very strictly woodenly literal interpretation of prophetic scriptures, particularly in Daniel and Revelation, to current and future events, was a massive increase in the interest of the state of the Jews. Part of that was because of this very literal interpretation of scripture, especially these prophetic scriptures, then would only allow, because it's so literal, the interpretation of the word Israel in those passages to mean literally ethnic Jewish people and their restoration to Palestine. Part of that was because the condition of the Jews in Europe and in Russia was appalling. Um, they didn't have a nation, of course. I mean, you can look on the history of that. It was terrible. And one of the main movers behind this, and one of the main early proponents that would lead to dispensationalism. Oops, I just got rid of the name. Is Louis Ray, Wray. And he and others joined into, let's say, societies that began to search out, meet together in annual conferences, search prophetic scriptures, and they became convinced that not only should you apply very literally again the prophetic scriptures to world, current, and future events, and second then would be the restoration of the Jews. And because of their very literal chronological interpretation of these scriptures, they began to see that the second return of Christ, the advent of Christ, would be happening very soon. And it would happen before the millennium. Now, there was no such thing as a secret rapture idea then. This is early 1800s. That didn't come until 1830s, and it really wasn't solidified until 1843 by Darby, but we'll get to that in a minute. And so, anyways, let me pause that and return to what I was trying to teach you in session one. The traditional biblical historical way of interpreting the Bible, if you listen to my sermon on Sunday, you'll hear this. When you come to any text, you should interpret it according to what the words are saying there grammatically, to its historical context. So there's some literal things happening there, but there's almost always a spiritual, even figurative meaning. So, for instance, in the history of the interpretation of, let's say, the term Israel in prophetic literature, it did typically apply to events happening in the life of the prophet or soon to happen around then. That was literally about the nation of Israel or Judah and their punishment by God and exile and God's promise of return. So there was a grammatical, the words actually meant something in that historical context. But they would often, almost always, then use it in a more spiritual, deeper sense, figurative, to mean, well, to Christ and his ultimate eternal restoration of God's people, the remnant. And that's been the norm historical for the first 2,000 years or so until this time. That was set aside for this very literal, and really they would begin to totally separate from anybody who would, interpret the Bible in any other way but that. Okay, from there, so again, the background is it's dark days. French Revolution, a lot of upheaval, unsettling. This spurred, it seems, a turn towards those parts of the Bible that mirrored that kind of condition, the apocalyptic prophetic literature. There began then to be just a real interest in dating and current events and restoration of the Jews, dating the coming of Christ, and millennialism. Okay, this takes us up till 19 or 1825, 6, 24, 25, 26, something like that. Edward Irving. He is a founding father of what would become after from Darby dispensationalism. Now he was like a shooting star. He went off, and then he was an outcast because he just never was grounded and went into all kinds of strange excesses. But a very interesting guy, sincere. Um, but one of the things he began to teach under the influence of a guy named James Frere, Frere, and then he somehow found the Spanish copy of this Jesuit, Roman Catholic Jesuit monk priest who was from South America, a treatise called The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty. And he translated it from Spanish into English. Now, at that time, from what I understand, doing the study on it, he didn't know Spanish. And it was just in the weeks leading up to translating this that he taught himself Spanish in order to translate it. So this guy was some kind of genius. Well, this started influencing, kind of systematizing this system that had been building for the last 20, 30 years. And it started these conferences. So this movement, this um, whatever you want to call it, this millenarian tradition, this prophetic focus, apocalyptic focus on the second advent of Christ, restoration of the Jews, premillennialism, and so on. It was largely carried from here on out through conferences. You'll hear this again and again as we look at the history over the next couple of weeks. In England and Scotland at the time, the first of these were called the Albury conferences, beginning in 1826, and I think they met for several years. Guys like Edward Irving, Henry Drummond, Lewis Ray, and others, and they had concern. Their main concerns again were what we've just talked about: the prophetic calendar. Can we look at the Bible and figure out the dates so that we can figure out what's coming and when Christ will return? And then, so that's the timing of Christ's second coming, and then the restoration of the Jews. Those are their three main concerns. And their conclusions, so after 3 years of these conferences in 1826, 27, 28, 29, or 4 years of conferences, they had 6 conclusions. And these will sound very familiar if you grew up in the dispensational world. The church age, the current dispensations from Acts chapter 2 and the Pentecost, this age of the church is coming to an end soon in their day. So again, we're in 1829. Their understanding of Daniel and Revelation, the other apocalyptic literature in the Bible, teaches them that just like the Jews came to a cataclysmic end in the exile, so the church age is about to end in a blaze of destruction. God's judgment is being poured out on the Christians, on the church, because the church is completely, utterly, and unsavably corrupt. This is a hallmark of the dispensational, this early movement. This was his main thing. The church is completely corrupt, and the church age is about to end cataclysmically in judgment on the Christians. At that time, then, the Jews will be restored to Palestine, and it will begin the literal 1,000 years of Christ's reign. Remember, again, we're in 1829 now. So Christ will return before this millennium. The Jews will be restored to Palestine because the church age is ended in cataclysm. They began to date then the 1,260 years in Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation 13, beginning with the reign of Emperor Justinian, from that date to the French Revolution. So they dated that in their day in 1829, the first 15 chapters of Revelation were fulfilled. And they were somewhere in the middle of Revelation chapter 16, that the vials of wrath were being poured out and it was about to end. Everything, the lights were about to go out on the church age, on Christianity, and so on. Now, again, at that time, the idea of a secret rapture of the church was unknown. That wasn't a part of this program. That became to be part of the program as a way to figure out how that all would take place. They didn't get that from church history. They didn't get that from scriptural interpretation. That just became a way to understand how that would all happen. So that wasn't even on the table yet. Um, and they all agreed, all of these early millenarian, apocalyptic kind of focus, they all agreed that Christ's second coming would be within a few years, all of them. They set some dates. The two main are 1843, and you'll hear more about that next time, and 1848. Those are the two dates. Now, I want to bring this up again. I want to be careful because I don't want to just totally rock your world or scandalize you, but this is something that Christ himself warned us to not do. And their date setting has been disproved. It's wrong. They were wrong from the very beginning. So, not only if you look at the history of this objectively, not only do you see that it's novel, this sort of thing, these conclusions that they were reaching were unknown before this in the history of the church and the interpreting of the Bible. So they're novel. And so that's concerning. But what's also concerning is their prophetic calendar. They're equating certain, verses of the Bible to current events of their day and future events of their day, are wrong. And their dating of Christ's return from the beginning is wrong. And so there's a foundational issue to this way of interpreting the Bible. Okay, so we are now in the late 1820s, and at this time, it's a small thing. This is just a little thing happening in one little part of the world, but from here it just takes off. 1825 to 1828, it really grows. These conferences, they're writing a lot, and non-millenarian Christian, you know, magazines, let's say at that time, periodicals, are reading what they're writing and starting to write about it, critiquing it. So it's spreading it. Societies are getting established. People are moving out of their churches and denominations and starting alternative gatherings. And so Irving, the gentleman I mentioned before, was kind of the main voice of this. He was well spoken, well regarded, um, but he flamed out real quick. Uh, but it's at that time that who will be the founders of the Plymouth Brethren, and ultimately Darby's one of them, dispensationalism, they begin to join in this. Uh, and as I said, these guys are now starting to they never wanted to found their own denomination, although I don't know, what are you going to do when all Christians leave one kind of church and then start gathering together? What do you call that? Like, oh, it's another church denomination. But this is a hallmark of it. Withdrawal from your church, from your denomination. Why? Well, the end is near. Christ is about to come. The church is incurably corrupt. And so they just began to thought that it's better for Christians just to gather together in the name of Christ. No leadership, no hierarchy, just simple gathering. And that's what kind of began all of this. Okay, so it's at this time that the two names that begin what you might call dispensationalism come together. Newton and Darby. I'm sure that you have heard these names. Um, so John Nelson Darby is the main one, but he was brought into this by a guy named Newton, whose first name, I don't know why I didn't write it down, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. Anyways, Newton was at Oxford studying for, I believe it was the pastorate, and this is 1827, and he was getting involved in this millenarian focus, and he brought Darby to his first meeting. Darby was an Anglican Church of England priest ordained in there, and he had a a good history. He was a good pastor, it seems like. But from 1827 to 1830, there began Darby was brought into Newton, and they were beginning to be part of this. In 1831, in Scotland, this is where Darby and Newton were from, in Dublin, began another series of conferences called the Power Court Conferences. Again, just like you heard of the conferences before, same same kind of focus from the Albury conferences, millenarian subjects. So they were focusing on prophecy and current events and timing of the coming of Christ. They were only, just like before, interpreting these prophetic scriptures as current or future. We typically call it futuristic interpretation of them, rather than kind of a more grammatical, historical, figurative, often called more historical interpretation. So they're like trying to map out literal chronologies of future events. Again, that sounds very familiar to you if you were in this. This is what was carried over from there. And so again, they came to some of the conclusions that the Asbury Conference people did, that the first 15 chapters of Revelation are fulfilled, and that they were fulfilled by 1827, and just by the events happening in Europe. And so they kind of came up with their three conclusions, that this way to interpret the Bible very literally, but only kind of futuristically, such that the chronology showed that Revelation is almost done, and Darby brought this focus on the complete apostasy of churches. So by the third of these conferences, of these Power Court conferences in 1833, that's the first time that Darby brought in this idea of the secret rapture. And we don't know where he got it from. In his writings, from all that I've studied, nobody knows where he picked this up from or how he came to it. Because again, before this, even in these first 30 some years of this kind of focus, this is not mentioned, and definitely not mentioned previous to that in church history or in any biblical interpretation. And even at that time, Darby wasn't convinced of it. That wouldn't be until 1843, a full decade later. And so he began to bring these ideas. So what would happen in these conferences? They would come, they would study some of the prophetic scripture, somebody would teach on it, they would debate it for hours, and then they'd try to come up with a conclusion. And so they would bring up these ideas. And one of them that Darby brought in 1833 was the idea of a secret rapture combined with seeing a pause on the prophetic clock. You've probably heard that before, where God's program with Israel has been paused, the prophetic clock is paused, and we're in this church age that's about to end cataclysmically. And so this is the beginning of the Plymouth Brethren and dispensationalism. Now, we'll do more next time, because we're about out of time, on Darby and Newton, because that's very interesting, and more on Darby. He's kind of a unique guy, really, really godly and admirable in some sense, and it looks like kind of a tyrant in others. But Newton opposed those two doctrines completely, and it would lead ultimately to their separation. He never bought into the secret rapture of the church, nor to this kind of prophetic timetable-ish, and especially not this pause. In fact, he said that the rapture was, a bad enough error, but this other idea of this kind of prophetic pause is worse. Okay, so that's enough for me for today, except one other thing. One of the difficulties we're going to run into in this is this idea of premillennialism. I'm using this term millenarianism to describe what this movement that began in 1800-ish was. And out of that came this understanding that this 1,000 years that's only mentioned in Revelation 20, we're talking about, when does Jesus return for a second time in relation to that millennium? Does he return beforehand, premillennial? Does it return at the end of it, post-millennial? Or is the millennium a kind of figurative language for the church age, and Christ will return at the end of it. That's amillennialism. So premillennialism has been a historical understanding of Christians from the very earliest. But that early historical premillennialism isn't what we're talking about here among these millenarians. That's a whole new kind of premillennialism, and so it makes it a bit confusing because they're going to claim the dispensational claim that no, premillennialism has been around forever, but their kind of premillennialism and the historical kind of premillennialism are not the same at all. And so just to get that out on the table and confuse us more. Okay, so where from here? We'll focus a bit more in on our next session on Newton and Darby and the Plymouth Brethren, and then their move to the U.S. Because right now we've only been in England and Scotland, basically. So that's the history. Again, what I'm trying to do is just show you the actual historical realities, and to try to help you become aware that some of the doctrines or the ways that you maybe grew up interpreting the Bible, or that many of us in America have been affected by, are kind of new kids on the block, not known before the early 1800s, um, and their doctrinal conclusions, um, so they're novel, and their kind of prophetic, futuristic timetable setting is unhelpful at best, and at worst, false. The dates are wrong and warned against by Christ himself. Okay. Again, I hope this is helpful. If you have questions, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll be back sometime in the next couple of days with part 4 of this series, but kind of part 2 on the history of it. Okay. Thank you. Bye.